We celebrate venture capitalists as innovators, build statues to admirals and naval heroes. But here's what no one tells you. The real pioneers of risk capital, equity splits, and profit sharing weren't in boardrooms or naval academies. They were criminals. In the 1600s and 1700s, while kings and merchants were running monopolies and keeping workers as near slaves, pirates created something different. They wrote contracts. They voted on decisions. They divided profits fairly. They invented disability insurance. And they did all of this a century before the ideas reached legitimate business. The question isn't whether pirates were good people. The question is, why did outlaws invent better economic systems than empires? Here's what this video will show you. The structures we think of as modern capitalism, venture funding, equity stakes, democratic governance, risk sharing, they didn't come from universities or enlightened kings. They came from necessity. From people who had nothing and couldn't rely on the system. Pirate crews were startup companies. Every voyage was a funding round. Every captain was a CEO who could be voted out. And the economic model they created was so efficient that it actually worked better than the legal economies around them. You're going to see three things today. First, how pirate crews structured deals that mirror modern venture capital, down to the percentage splits. Second, how this model compared to the legitimate economies of the time, and why it was superior in almost every way. Third, what this tells us about where real innovation comes from, and why systems outside the law often evolve faster than systems inside it. It's 1680. A pirate ship is preparing to leave Port Royal, Jamaica. Before the ship even leaves harbor, something unusual happens. The crew gathers, they negotiate, and then they sign a document called the Articles. These weren't vague agreements, these were detailed contracts. The captain got 2 shares of any prize. The quartermaster, the second dingy man who represented the crew, got 1.5 shares. Skilled workers like the surgeon, carpenter, and gunner got 1.25 shares. Everyone else got 1 share. But here's the revolutionary part. The crew voted. They voted on where to go. They voted on whether to attack a target. And if the captain was incompetent or cruel, they voted him out. Some pirate ships went through 3 or 4 captains in a single voyage. Compare this to the British Royal Navy. Sailors had no say. They were often kidnapped off the street, a practice called impressment. They were beaten regularly. They weren't paid until the end of a voyage, sometimes years later. If they were injured, they got nothing. The captain had total power. Pirates invented something else too, insurance. If you lost an eye in battle, you got 100 pieces of 8, about 6 months' wages. Lost a leg? 100 pieces of 8? Lost your right arm? 600 pieces of 8 because you couldn't fight anymore? This was disability compensation. In 1680, the British Navy didn't have anything like this until the 1800s. Did it work? Absolutely. Pirate crews were more loyal, fought harder, and stayed together longer than many naval crews. Desertion rates were lower. Morale was higher. When you have a stake in the outcome and a voice in decisions, you care more. The consequence here is not collapse. It's that this model was so threatening to established power that governments spent decades hunting pirates down. Not just because of stolen cargo, but because they represented a different way of organizing society. The pirates who survived weren't the most violent. They were the ones who understood the economics. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, captured over 400 ships using this system. He died in battle, but his crew walked away rich. Henry Morgan retired wealthy and became lieutenant governor of Jamaica, legitimized by the same system that once wanted him dead. The men who joined pirate crews often came from merchant ships, where they were paid almost nothing. On a pirate ship, an ordinary seaman could make in one good capture what he'd earn in 5 years of legitimate work. The model redistributed wealth in a way the legal economy never would. Now shift forward to the 1700s and look at something called privateering. This was legal piracy. A ship owner would get a letter of marque from a king, essentially a license to attack enemy ships during wartime. Here's where it gets interesting. Privateering worked exactly like venture capital works today. A wealthy investor, usually a merchant or group of merchants, would fund the voyage. They'd pay for the ship, the supplies, the weapons, the crew wages up front. This was the investment. Then they'd negotiate the split. Typically, the investor kept 50 to 60% of any captured goods. The ship's owner got 10 to 15%. The captain got 5 to 8%. The crew split the rest. Sound familiar? In modern venture capital, the VC fund keeps 50 to 70% equity. Founders get 20 to 30%. Early employees split what's left. The model is identical. Risk capital, equity stakes, massive upside if it works, total loss if it doesn't. The system worked so well that by the 1750s, privateering was a major part of the British economy. During the War of Spanish Succession, British privateers captured more Spanish wealth than the Royal Navy did. Private capital, with skin in the game, outperformed the state. But here's the dark side. After the wars ended, thousands of privateers had no legal work. The skills didn't transfer, the economy didn't need them, and he became pirates, illegal privateers. The system created a class of armed, skilled, economically displaced men, and then criminalized them when they kept doing what they'd been trained to do. The investors did well. They diversified. A wealthy merchant might fund 10 privateering voyages. If 7 failed and 3 succeeded, they still made a profit. It's the exact logic of a VC portfolio today. The captains who were smart saved their earnings and bought land or started legitimate businesses. The ones who didn't often ended up hanged. The system rewarded those who understood it was temporary. In both cases, pirate crews and privateers, you see the same thing. When people can't rely on established systems, they invent better ones. The new systems use equity, shared risk, and incentives instead of hierarchy and force. Now look at what was considered legitimate business during the same period. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. The British East India Company was founded in 1600. These were the most powerful corporations in history. And they were doing the exact same thing as pirates, just with government permission. The East India Companies worked like this. Private investors bought shares. The company raised enormous amounts of capital, millions in today's money. They used it to build ships, hire armies, and establish trade routes. But here's the key. They had monopolies. If you were Dutch and you wanted to trade in Asia, you went through the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, or you were a criminal. The government enforced this with violence. These companies didn't just trade. They conquered. They governed. The British East India Company ruled India for a century. They had their own armies, their own courts, their own money, or sovereign powers, but owned by shareholders. The human cost was staggering. Famines in Bengal killed millions because the company prioritized profit over food distribution. The Dutch massacred entire populations in the Spice Islands to control nutmeg and clove prices. This wasn't capitalism. This was extraction backed by state violence. And eventually, both companies collapsed. The Dutch VOC went bankrupt in 1799, the largest corporate bankruptcy in history at that time. The British East India Company was dissolved in 1874 after the Indian Rebellion. Monopolies become bloated. They stop innovating, assume they'll last forever. Early shareholders made fortunes. The company officers made fortunes. The locals lost everything. The pattern is always the same. When profits are privatized and losses are socialized, when risk is protected by state force instead of market discipline, the system eventually breaks. Compare this to pirate crews. Pirates couldn't rely on monopolies or state protection. If they failed, they died, so they stayed efficient. They innovated. They kept governance tight. One more story, and it's the darkest one. In the 1600s and 1700s, enslaved Africans on captured slave ships sometimes escaped or were freed during pirate attacks. Many joined pirate crews. These men were called Liberi. On pirate ships, freed slaves got the same shares as everyone else. They voted. They fought. They were treated as equals under the Articles. This wasn't kindness, it was economics. On a ship where everyone's survival depends on everyone else, you can't have a two-tier system. It doesn't work. Some pirate crews were 30 to 40% black. Some had black quartermasters and captains. In a world where slavery was legal and normal, pirate ships were among the only places where former slaves could be free and armed and equal. This terrified colonial government. The Bahamas in the 1710s became a pirate haven with a mixed-race population living under pirate law. It was the nightmare scenario for slave economies, proof that another system was possible. The British crushed it. They sent a massive naval force, offered pardons to pirates who would betray each other, and hanged the rest. By 1720, the pirate era was mostly over. Some former slaves used their pirate earnings to buy land in places like Jamaica or the American colonies. Others disappeared into port cities and became merchants or sailors. The system gave them capital and skills they couldn't have gotten any other way, but most ended up dead. The historical record is sparse. They were erased because they were proof that the systems of empire and slavery weren't inevitable. Across all these stories, from pirate articles to privateer funding to company monopolies to freed slaves with equity stakes, you see the same economic truth? Systems that share risk and reward, that give people a voice and a stake, outperform systems that concentrate power. But the second model, concentration of power, is always protected by force because it benefits the few at the top. Let's make this clear. First pattern: equity and ownership create better outcomes than wages and hierarchy. Pirates split profits. Privaters split profits. Venture capital splits equity. When everyone has skin in the game, efficiency goes up and loyalty goes up. When people are paid flat wages with no upside, they do the minimum. Second pattern: systems outside the law innovate faster. Pirates invented disability insurance, democratic governance, and equity splits 100 years before they became normal and legitimate business. Why? Because they had to. Evolution happens faster when failure means death. Third pattern: monopolies kill innovation. The East India companies had state protection and monopolies, became corrupt, bloated, and extractive. They stopped competing. Eventually, they collapsed. Pirate crews competed every day. If you couldn't attract good sailors, you failed. The discipline of markets applied even to criminals. Fourth pattern: power fears alternatives. Governments didn't hunt pirates just because of theft. They hunted them because pirate crews proved a different model could work. Freed slaves with weapons and wealth, workers with votes and profit sharing. That was a threat to the entire social order. The system protects itself by eliminating examples of other possibilities. So what does this mean now? Look at modern venture capital. It uses the privateer model exactly. Investors fund higher-risk ventures, take equity stakes, expect most to fail, and win big on the few that succeed. The language is different. Cap table instead of prize split, liquidation event instead of captured cargo. But the structure is identical. And look at how startups talk about themselves. They're disrupting industries. They're moving fast and breaking things. They're proud to be outsiders, challenging established systems. That's pirate rhetoric. It's a romance of the outsider who builds something new because the old system is broken. But here's the uncomfortable part. Modern corporations, once they succeed, do exactly what the East India companies did. They lobby for regulations that block competitors. They buy politicians. They argue they're too big to fail. They stop being pirates and become the Navy. They stop innovating and start extracting. Google, Amazon, Facebook, they all started as insurgents. Now they're monopolies, using state power to protect their position. Cycle repeats. And notice what gets criminalized. File sharing, cryptocurrency outside state control, gig economy platforms that bypass labor law. Whenever a new model threatens the established one, the state calls it piracy and tries to shut it down. Sometimes they succeed. Sometimes the pirates win and become the new establishment. The mechanisms are the same, only the names change. So what do you do with this information? First, understand that innovation often comes from the edges, not the center. The best ideas rarely come from people at the top of the system. They come from people who are locked out and have to build something new. If you want to see the future, look at what's being called illegal or disruptive today. Second, equity matters more than wages. Pirates understood this in 1680. If you're working for someone else with no ownership stake, you re-in the position of a Royal Navy sailor, you repaid just enough to keep you from leaving. If you can, find ways to have skin in the game. Ownership, even small amounts, changes everything. Third, monopolies always claim they're permanent, and they're always wrong. The East India companies thought they'd last forever. They collapsed. Every dominant system thinks it's the end of history. It never is. The question is whether you see the transition coming. Fourth, the law protects the powerful, not the fair. Pirates were hanged for doing on a small scale what the East India Companies did on a massive scale. The difference was permission. Don't confuse legality with morality, and don't assume the legal system is designed for your benefit. Fifth, diversification is survival. Privateer investors funded multiple ships because they knew most would fail. Pirate captains who saved their money and bought land survived. The ones who spent everything or assumed the good times would last ended up dead. Same lesson as always. Don't put everything in one place. Sixth, systems that share power last longer than systems that concentrate it. Pirate crews with democratic governance stayed together. Tyrannical captains got mutinied. Top-down control feels efficient, but it's fragile. If you're building something, build in accountability and voice. Seventh, your economic system is a choice, not a law of nature. For 300 years, people were told that monarchy, slavery, and monopoly were the only ways to organize society. Pirate crews proved otherwise. Today you're told the current system is the only option. It's not. Alternatives exist, they're just not legal yet. Here's the truth they don't teach you. Every major economic innovation, equity, profit sharing, insurance, venture capital, was invented by people who couldn't use the official system. Outcasts, criminals, the desperate. They built better models because they had no choice. The pirates aren't the villains of this story. They're the proof that when the system doesn't work, people invent new ones. The new ones often work better. Collapse isn't failure. Collapse is transition. The question is whether you'll see it coming. So ask yourself this. Are you waiting for permission from the system, or are you building something new outside it? Are you the Navy, sailing slowly in formation, or are you the pirate, moving fast because you have to? History doesn't pick sides. It just watches who adapts. If this changed how you see power and innovation, hit subscribe.